So we can talk about some of the things that we could do to ensure that our future is more sustainable. And this is a list that is taken from the textbook. So this is also some of these things, these ideas we've actually already talked about this quarter. So the first one is that we need to internalize externalities. Internalize externalities. So an externality is a cost that we do not take into consideration when we consider the cost of a good or service. So you might not take into consideration the cost of recycling your cell phone when you buy your cell phone. So have you paid for it to be recycled with the cost of the purchase of it? Or is it just going to go into a landfill somewhere and degrade the environment? So that would be an example. Now, remember that there are different ways that we can go about this. One is command and control. So you could have laws and regulations that prohibit maybe the use of cell phones. No, that's not a good one, but would actually prohibit, make regulations, and that is governmental regulations. But we could also do a market-based approach. So your textbook actually says that the market-based approach is probably better. So this means that you raise the cost, right? So that you actually raise the cost of the item so that it represents its true cost. And that's really sometimes hard to estimate. Like, what is the cost of the cell phone after it is become not useful anymore, right? So one of the ideas is that you could create a higher price, and that will actually, the high price will actually discourage the consumption of something that is environmentally damaging. So the idea is that higher prices will discourage use of environmentally damaging goods and services. So, say, for example, fossil fuels. So really, our fossil fuel, the cost of your gasoline, I know this is very controversial, but it does not take into consideration all of the externalities of using fossil fuels. So perhaps if we made gasoline more expensive, people would choose to drive less. So maybe if gas is more expensive, you might decide that you are not going to drive across the country to take your vacation. You might decide to stay home and take your vacation, right? Or you might decide that it is better to live close to work than to live an hour away from work. So when you take into consideration the cost of gas, people are probably not going to be even able to afford long commutes. And so that is going to be a possible solution for this. Now, the government and people don't generally like this, but there is an ability to kind of balance it out through what is called revenue recycling. So let's talk about that idea of revenue recycling. So you could impose a tax on gas. Okay. So gas becomes more expensive, but then you cut payroll taxes. Right? So you're paying less taxes out of your paycheck. And this actually gives people the option, if they wanted to be more efficient and have efficient vehicles, and they didn't want to drive long distances to and from work, they could do that and they would actually save more money. So this actually puts it on the consumer to make some decisions. If you tax, which taxes are not popular, but if you tax gas and then cut your payroll taxes, those people who choose to use less fossil fuels are going to benefit overall and in the long run, which will be good for everybody in the long run of the future of the planet. Even a generation down the line, one generation, it could make a difference. So that is the idea of revenue recycling. The second step would be to eliminate subsidies. So subsidies are things that our government puts into place, and it generally is written into the tax code. So this is like tax cuts for certain corporations. That's where most of the subsidies come from. You could also actually say that when we get a child tax, like we get a child tax credit, the government is subsidizing us having children. Maybe that's not a good idea if we want to reduce population sizes, right? But then that opening up that whole can of worms also is problematic, because if we don't have a certain number of children growing up behind the population, then our population ages and there's nobody to take care of the old people. So anyway, but eliminating subsidies would be a good start. Actually, it would be a really important part of this, because these subsidies are oftentimes linked with environmental degradation. So your textbook talks about farming near the Everglades in Florida, and the Everglades are being polluted with phosphorus that is running off the fields, and it's causing all kinds of problems. You might have heard of, even on the coast, like you have cyanobacteria blooms, algae blooms that are poisonous, that kill all the animals in the ocean. They float up, and it just creates this horrible, horrible thing that happens. And so we have subsidized the sugar industry in Florida, the government has, by making sure that they profit. They have a much higher profit on their sugar than other corporations in the rest of the world, right? So we're subsidizing that agricultural industry. But if we didn't subsidize them, then they wouldn't be able to afford perhaps to pollute as much. And so that's an externality as well, but eliminating the subsidies. Now, the problem with that is once you put it into a tax code, getting it out of the tax code is very difficult, because then people start to lose money and they get very upset. And specifically, if you're a corporation and you have a lot of lobbying power, then you can go to Washington and lobby politicians and try to persuade them to act on your behalf. And so that eliminating subsidies probably is not going to be something that is going to happen very rapidly or very readily within our political system. So then we come to 3, which is your personal choices. So personal choices, and this is the one we like to think will make a big difference, right? Personal choices. Unfortunately, maybe the scale of our economy makes it difficult for personal choices. And we like to think about this because we like to be free individuals, especially in this country, right? I like to have the choice of buying a gas guzzling vehicle. If I want to, I should have that choice, right? But there are personal choices that can make a slight difference, and there's personal choices that can make bigger differences. So your textbook talks about these, like the difference between buying something that's made from recycled glass versus non-recycled glass. That's probably not something that is going to have a dramatic effect. Even plastic bags versus paper bags probably not going to have a large enough scale of effect, right? It's probably doesn't mean that you shouldn't do it, but you have to look at what are like the big things you can do. So again, that comes down to scale and efficiency. So, they all say, or you hear this, reduce the size of your house, reduce the number of cars you own, right? Reduce, recycle, or reduce, got those out of order, reuse and recycle. So reuse is kind of questionable, especially if you're talking about vehicles, because sometimes those vehicles, you have to weigh the efficiency if they're old vehicles to the cost of getting a new vehicle, which is also, so it's like balancing those things. And then recycling is actually the last thing. So the best thing you could do is reduce. Now, they also talk about efficiency, right? So if you are going to buy an appliance, for example, it's really important to think about spending the extra money on that because you will save money. So oftentimes it's very hard to say, okay, I'm going to buy a super efficient refrigerator, but it's going to cost a lot more. But looking at it in the long term, you will save money in the long term. So efficiency is also something that you really need to take into consideration as personal choices to become more efficient in your use of resources and goods. Your textbook makes note, it's very interesting, about how if you have a landlord and you pay the utilities, the cost of the electricity, oftentimes landlords, it makes more sense for them to buy cheap appliances that are not energy efficient because their renters are the ones that are going to be paying the utility bill. They're not paying the utility bill, so they're not going to save on the efficiency. So landlords, for example, they would have an incentive to buy the cheaper, or less efficient appliance. So there, maybe it's important for command and control to have some regulations that you have to meet a minimum standard of efficiency. So those are just some ideas about our sustainable future.